Hello, everyone. My name is Oliver, and welcome to the very first episode of my new political channel. This project is something I've been meaning to start for quite a while, but, as it often happens, hesitation, doubt, and second thoughts kept getting in the way. You know how it goes. You want to enter the arena, but you keep circling it, wondering if it's worth the effort, wondering whether your voice even matters, or whether anyone will care about what you're about to say. Over the last few years, I reached a point where I simply had to act after watching global events, scrolling through social media, and listening to Western commentary about Central and Eastern Europe, especially as I saw a mountain of misinformation being treated like truth. I realized that silence wasn't neutral. Silence meant letting half-truths, manipulations, and lazily repeated narratives shape the public perception of my part of the world. And since I've always enjoyed producing content, and I'm not intimidated by a camera or a microphone, taking action seemed like the natural next step. Let me be clear from the outset. I am not a retired general, a geopolitical analyst, or an academic from a think tank. I'm just a regular person, a working adult, a teacher by profession, and a writer by passion. And yet, like countless other ordinary Europeans, I live close enough to the fire to understand its heat. In Poland, geopolitics isn't some abstract chessboard. It's the background hum of daily life. History isn't a museum exhibit. It's family memory. Security is not merely a theoretical concept. It is a practical question. Now, since individuals online frequently inquire, "Who are you to comment on this?" here is a brief overview. I have 2 master's degrees, one in linguistics and one in sociology, specifically contemporary societies and culture. While that doesn't turn me into a geopolitical oracle, it does give me a solid foundation to observe, analyze, and synthesize information. But honestly, academic titles aren't the point here. You don't need a professorship to recognize propaganda, to compare sources, to see patterns, or to understand the difference between truth and spin. And that's part of why I'm launching this channel. The Western world, especially the US, Canada, and the UK, often receives narratives about Ukraine, Poland, and Russia that are wildly incomplete, outdated, or straight up wrong. Not because Westerners are stupid, they're not, but because their media ecosystems are saturated with noise. Add to that the enormous amount of Russian-origin disinformation circulating on social media, and it becomes almost impossible for a regular person with a full-time job to filter out the nonsense. Russian disinformation campaigns have been systematically analyzed and confirmed in multiple independent studies, including reports from the EU's East Stratcom Task Force, the US State Department, and the Atlantic Council's DFR lab. So here I am, someone who actually lives in this region, someone who grew up in the shadow of the fall of the Soviet Union, someone who has walked the streets, heard the conversations, and observed the mood shifts before, during, and after Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And I want to give you that perspective, unfiltered, grounded, and yes, sometimes blunt. So let me begin with something fundamental. Poland is not the strange, gloomy, backward corner of Europe that some Western commentators still imagine when they speak about the East. You'd be shocked how many times I've heard people from Western Europe or the US say things like, "Well, Eastern Europe has always been unstable," or "People there think differently, they're more nationalistic," or, my personal favorite, "Poland is somewhere near Russia, right?" Such statements not only cause mild irritation, but also expose a significant gap in understanding. Poland is a Central European country, a fully modern democracy, a member of the European Union since 2004, and a member of NATO since 1999. Our cities look like regular European cities. Our education system and digital infrastructure are deeply integrated with the EU. Our everyday life resembles Germany or the Czech Republic far more than it resembles anything east of Belarus. And yet, despite this, we're often painted with the same brush as Russia, which is absurd historically, culturally, and politically. In fact, if there's one nation in Europe that has consistently resisted Russian imperialism for centuries, it's Poland. We know the patterns, we know the playbook, and we've seen this cycle repeat enough times to recognize the early warning signs. But here's the nuance that Westerners often miss. Our caution toward Russia is not rooted in blind hatred. It's rooted in historical observation, geopolitical analysis, and lived experience. Russia has, for centuries, repeatedly acted as an imperial power toward its neighbors, partitioning Poland in the 18th century, crushing uprisings in the 19th century, invading Poland together with Nazi Germany in 1939, and imposing communist dictatorship until 1989. These are not emotional grievances, they're documented historical facts. So when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and then launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Polish reaction was not hysterical or paranoid. It was logical, predictable, even expected. People sometimes ask me, why are Poles so emotional about Ukraine? The answer is because we've seen this movie before, many times. We know that if Ukraine falls, Russia doesn't stop. It never has. Russian leadership, including Vladimir Putin himself, has openly articulated its doctrine of near abroad, the idea that former Soviet territories remain under Moscow's rightful influence. While some Western audiences may view geopolitical analysis as a theoretical exercise, Poland views it as practical. It's survival-oriented. It's not philosophical, it's personal. And this brings me to another misconception, the idea that Poles dislike Russians purely on an emotional level. It's not that simple. Many Poles can distinguish between Russian people and the Russian state. The issue is that the Russian state has consistently acted in ways that threaten its neighbors, and that threat is not theoretical. It's tangible and getting closer. Since 2022, there has been a dramatic increase in cyber attacks on Polish institutions, with confirmed links to Russian-affiliated groups. Attempts at sabotage, misinformation, and destabilization are now a weekly occurrence. Such activity isn't abstract hybrid warfare. The result is war waged with keyboards, servers, drones, hacks, and propaganda instead of tanks. And frankly, anyone who still pretends Russia is only fighting Ukraine and not conducting a broader campaign against NATO countries is either uninformed or intentionally blind. Now, let's talk about something that often surprises people in the West: the mindset of ordinary Poles. Many Westerners imagine us as either overly emotional about Russia or trapped in some Cold War paranoia. But that's not how it feels from the inside. For most of us, geopolitical awareness isn't a hobby, it's a necessity. It's like checking the weather. It's part of daily life. When you grow up in a region that has been, historically speaking, squeezed between empires, you develop a certain instinct, the ability to recognize shifts in the political climate, and the ability to see patterns repeating. That's not fear, that's generational memory reinforced by actual observable events. For example, ask an average American what their neighboring countries are doing politically, and many won't know, because they don't need to know. The US is geographically secure, but ask an average Pole what Russia is doing, and you'll receive a very clear, detailed answer. That's not because we're obsessed. It's because Russian actions affect everything from energy prices to border security to the safety of our allies. This regional awareness is something Western audiences often underestimate. They think we're overreacting, when in reality we're simply reacting appropriately to a threat that has materialized again and again, generation after generation. And honestly, such awareness brings me to one of the greatest frustrations many people in Poland feel toward Western commentary: the oversimplification, the superficial takes, and the complete lack of understanding of how things look from here. It's not rare to see Western pundits make bold, sweeping statements about Ukraine or Eastern Europe, while sitting comfortably in London, New York, Toronto, or Sydney, located thousands of kilometers away from the front line. Their analysis often lacks any real knowledge of local dynamics or regional historical memory. A commentator with 30 years of safety inside a stable democracy simply cannot speak with the same accuracy as someone who lives one border away from a hot war. And yet, these shallow interpretations become expert opinion in Western mainstream media. That's how you acquire absurd narratives like Ukraine can't win, so maybe we should negotiate. Russian aggression is the West's fault for provoking Moscow. Eastern Europeans are too emotional about Russia. Every single one of these claims has been debunked repeatedly, especially the idea that NATO provoked Russia, a narrative promoted heavily by the Kremlin. Russia itself signed multiple treaties acknowledging post-Cold War borders and recognizing NATO's right to expand, such as the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act. And yet, despite such clear documentation, the disinformation persists, because it's convenient. It gives Western audiences are presented with an easy narrative. This is complicated. Both sides are to blame. But the truth is not symmetrical here. Ukraine didn't invade Russia. Ukraine didn't annex Russian territory. Ukraine didn't send saboteurs into Russian cities. The direction of aggression is obvious. And Poles react strongly not because we're biased, but because we recognize the pattern. We've lived inside it for centuries. The last time the West ignored early signs of Russian expansionism, the result was decades of occupation, censorship, and complete suppression of civic freedoms. Therefore, when we raise alarms early, we are not being overly dramatic. We're being responsible. We're remembering what happens when the world looks away. And we're using our voices because we still have them. Another point I want to clarify early in this podcast is the difference between disliking Russian policies and disliking Russian people. These two things are often conflated, especially online, where nuance dies quickly and everything is flattened into hate or support. So let me make this obvious. I do not harbor hatred toward ordinary Russians. Most Poles don't. What we do have is a deep, justified mistrust toward the Russian state, because that state, in its modern form and in its historic forms, has consistently acted as an aggressor. This is not prejudice. This is not xenophobia. It's the direct result of centuries of concrete actions. When you invade your neighbors repeatedly, suppress their languages, rewrite their histories, and impose authoritarian rule, you create a legacy that has consequences. To understand why Poles feel the way they do, it helps to look at the last 250 years. From 1772 to 1918, Poland was split up between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and it literally disappeared from the map. During the 19th century, Russia executed Polish officers, deported entire families to Siberia, banned Polish in schools, and erased cultural institutions. These policies weren't random. They were part of a systematic effort to dismantle Polish identity. Then came the 20th century. In 1939, Russia invaded Poland alongside Nazi Germany under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That wasn't ancient history. That was 2 generations ago. After World War II, the Soviet Union installed a puppet communist regime that lasted until 1989. Poles lived under censorship, political repression, rigged elections, and a secret police force modeled directly on the KGB. This experience isn't trauma from antiquity. Our parents and grandparents lived through it. Some of us still remember shortages, propaganda broadcasts, and the fear of speaking openly. So when Westerners casually say, "Let's understand Russia's perspective," or "Maybe NATO expansion provoked them," they unknowingly repeat Kremlin narratives that ignore centuries of aggression. And I want people to understand how that sounds from the Polish side. It sounds like gaslighting on a geopolitical scale. It's the equivalent of telling a victim to empathize with their abuser's motives. Now, does this mean Poles wish harm upon Russian civilians? Absolutely not. Most Poles feel sympathy toward ordinary Russians, especially younger generations who dream of a normal, democratic country but are trapped under an authoritarian system. But sympathy is not the same as blindness. You can feel sorry for someone's situation while acknowledging that their government is dangerous, destabilizing, and hostile to its neighbors. And this is where we hit the sociological point I want to stress. Russian society has been conditioned for centuries to accept top-down authority. That's not an insult. That's an observation supported by countless studies in comparative political culture, for example, World Values Survey data. Concepts like individual responsibility, civic participation, or bottom-up pressure on government are simply less embedded in Russian civic culture than in Western European or North American contexts. This aspect matters because authoritarian regimes survive not just through repression, but through the passive acceptance of the population. In Russia, this acceptance has been normalized for generations. Critical thinking becomes a luxury rather than a habit when a society grows accustomed to receiving directives and facing consequences for questioning. In contrast, Poland fiercely fought for its freedom. Uprisings, underground movements, and a long struggle against totalitarian rule forged our civic culture. And that's why we react so strongly when we see Russia rolling the same imperial machinery into Ukraine. For us, it's not a distant conflict. It's a warning. And this brings me to yet another point that Western audiences often underestimate. How much Poland has invested, emotionally, economically, and politically, in helping Ukraine. The Polish response to the full-scale invasion in February 2022 was spontaneous and unplanned. It wasn't a PR move. It was instantaneous. Ordinary families drove to the border to pick up refugees they'd never met. People opened their homes, their wallets, and their spare rooms. Schools, hospitals, local governments, everyone scrambled to help. At one point, Poland hosted over 1.6 million Ukrainian refugees, the largest number in all of Europe, UNHCR data. Why did we react like this? The reaction was due to our profound understanding of what Ukraine was fighting for. It was not just about securing territory, not just about sovereignty. It was also about the freedom to live without the oppression of an empire. And we knew that if Ukraine stood firm, the entire eastern flank of Europe would be safer. In other words, supporting Ukraine wasn't charity. It was strategic, moral, and existential. And this is one of the misconceptions I want to break immediately in this podcast. The idea that Polish support for Ukraine is purely emotional or symbolic. It isn't. It's practical. It's rooted in the understanding that Poland is safer with a strong, independent, democratic Ukraine between us and Russia. If Ukraine falls, the front line moves to our border overnight. If Ukraine stands, Russia is weakened and contained. Western analysts who suggest maybe Ukraine should concede some territory for peace fundamentally misunderstand the logic of authoritarian regimes. If you reward aggression, you get more aggression. Russia didn't stop after Georgia in 2008. It didn't stop after Crimea in 2014. It didn't stop after the Donbass. And it won't stop after Ukraine. Appeasement never works with imperial powers. European history is full of examples proving this point, the most famous being the Munich Agreement of 1938, where Western powers allowed Hitler to annex Czechoslovakia in the name of peace. We all know how that ended. Foreign policy discussions often cite this historical event as the pinnacle of appeasement diplomacy. So when you hear Polish politicians, experts, or ordinary citizens saying, "Support Ukraine now or pay later," that's not hyperbole. That's a straightforward reading of history. If Ukraine loses, Russia is emboldened. It strengthens not just militarily, but also ideologically. A victory in Ukraine would reinforce its belief that the West is weak, divided, and unwilling to defend democratic values. And if that becomes the narrative inside the Kremlin, the world becomes more dangerous, not less. Now, one thing I need to address is the Western hesitation that emerges every few months. The debates about whether aid is too expensive, whether it's worth it, whether Ukraine can really win, and whether supporting them is a favorable investment. Let's be honest. These questions reveal something about political comfort in the West. When your cities aren't being shelled, when your borders aren't under threat, when you're thousands of kilometers away from the conflict, it's easy to talk about war fatigue. However, only those who are safe can afford to experience war fatigue. Poles, the Baltic states, Finns, and Ukrainians don't have that luxury. We cannot become tired of defending our region, because the alternative is waking up one day to discover the war at our doorstep. So yes, from our perspective, supporting Ukraine is not just a moral obligation, it's a self-defense mechanism. It's the shield that protects all of Europe. Now, let's delve into a slightly more contentious area, one that I believe requires open discussion despite potential repercussions. I'm talking about the Western tendency to view Eastern European concerns as emotional, paranoid, or provincial. This patronizing attitude has been around for decades, and it surfaces every time Russia escalates aggression. You see it in op-eds, comment sections, think tank debates, university lectures, and even among diplomats who should know better. One of the most common refrains is, "Eastern Europeans are too emotional about Russia." Well, let's unpack that. If your country had been invaded, partitioned, occupied, censored, terrorized, and economically drained by the same empire over and over for centuries, would your caution be emotional or rational? History is not trauma porn, it's context. Living on the boundary between free Europe and authoritarian expansionism shapes your instincts through lived experience, not hysteria. Here's the uncomfortable truth the West often avoids. Many Eastern European countries predicted Russia's moves long before Western leaders took them seriously. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Ukraine had been warning for years that Russia was preparing for something far bigger than hybrid warfare. These warnings were dismissed as alarmism, until 2022 proved them right. Even NATO later acknowledged that Eastern intelligence assessments were accurate and early, while several Western agencies underestimated the scale of the looming invasion. The irony is that the countries closest to Russia, geographically, culturally, and historically, turned out to have the clearest understanding of what was coming. The emotional ones were the ones who happened to be right. Another Western misconception is the idea that Eastern Europe is somehow less modern or less developed. I've heard Americans and Western Europeans say things that sound like they're describing Europe in the 1980s rather than 2025. Statements like, "Do you have excellent internet there? Is Poland part of the Eurozone? Is it safe to travel in Eastern Europe? Do people still struggle with communism mentally? Poland's digital infrastructure is among the fastest in the EU. Crime rates in many Polish cities are lower than in major Western capitals. English proficiency in Poland consistently ranks in the top 15 worldwide." This outdated perception doesn't just irritate people, it affects policy. Western countries sometimes assume that because they're wealthier or historically more stable, their analysis must be more accurate. But geopolitics doesn't work like that. Wealth doesn't grant insight. Distance doesn't grant objectivity. And dismissing the voices of those living closer to the threat undermines collective security. Moreover, some Western analysts mistakenly perceive Russia's aggressive actions as a response to NATO expansion, rather than recognizing the true root cause: Russia's deeply ingrained imperial mindset. NATO didn't expand toward Russia. Central and Eastern European countries ran toward NATO because they wanted to escape Russian influence. Membership was voluntary, demanded by the population, and based on stated principles. People don't flee into an alliance unless they're afraid of what's behind them. And trust me, we were. This perspective needs to be said openly, especially for Western audiences who rarely hear it explained without euphemisms. In this region, NATO isn't considered provocation. It's considered protection, the only reliable one we've ever known. Another aspect that deserves attention is the nature of the current conflict itself. Many people in the West still imagine war in a very 20th century way. Tanks rolling in, planes bombing cities, and soldiers taking positions. And yes, that's happening in Ukraine right now. Brutally, openly, undeniably. But what Western audiences often overlook is that Russia has been waging a parallel war across Europe for years. And that conflict doesn't always look like artillery fire. It looks like cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, sabotage attempts, political influence operations, and the deliberate flooding of social media with false narratives. Poland, in particular, has been a major target. The number of documented cyber attacks against Polish institutions skyrocketed after the invasion of Ukraine. According to the Polish National Cybersecurity Center, attacks linked to Russian-affiliated groups have increased year after year, especially since 2022. These weren't random hacks. They were coordinated attempts to undermine critical infrastructure, government systems, medical facilities, and media outlets. Russia's goal is simple: to create confusion, sow distrust, and weaken societal cohesion. Then there's disinformation, one of the most effective weapons in Russia's modern arsenal. The EU, NATO, and independent researchers have extensively documented Russian propaganda efforts. These campaigns aim to polarize societies, amplify internal conflicts, and create information fog where truth becomes optional. The Kremlin doesn't need you to believe Russian propaganda. It only needs you to distrust everything, including your own institutions. And that strategy has been alarmingly successful in certain corners of the Western internet. Poland has been hit with waves of coordinated disinformation campaigns intended to portray Ukrainian refugees as criminals or welfare abusers, fuel anti-immigrant sentiment, undermine trust in NATO, spread conspiracy theories about Polish involvement in the war, trigger conflicts between Poland and Ukraine. These narratives are not organic, they're manufactured. A significant portion of them originate from troll farms, bot networks, and state-sponsored propaganda channels, many documented by the EU's East Stratcom task force. What frustrates many Poles is how easily some Western audiences fall for these manipulations. While we in Central Europe have spent decades learning to identify the tone, rhetoric, and tactics of Russian-language disinformation, many Western users simply haven't had that training. They scroll, they read, they react emotionally, and suddenly Kremlin narratives infect their worldviews without them even noticing. Hybrid warfare is not a buzzword, it's a daily experience here. And this is why the Polish mindset differs so drastically from the Western one. You cannot compare the mindset of someone who lives thousands of kilometers away from a hostile authoritarian state with that of someone living next door to it. Distance breeds comfort. Proximity breeds realism. And here's the key point. For Poland, the war did not start in 2022. It didn't even start in 2014. It began long ago, when Russia adopted a strategy of dismantling Western unity through digital sabotage, political interference, and the weakened democratic institutions. The tanks were simply the final stage, not the beginning. This is why Poles react so strongly when someone says, "It's not our war." From our perspective, it is undeniably our war. It has been for years. It just took the rest of the world a long time to notice. Now I want to pivot slightly and address something that always triggers debates, especially in the United States. And that is the idea that America is footing the bill for Ukraine, or that Europe isn't doing enough, or the infamous claim that Ukraine is draining US taxpayers. These talking points have become increasingly common, especially within certain political circles, and they tend to spread rapidly because they sound emotionally appealing. But when you look at the actual numbers, the narrative collapses. Let's start with the myth that the US is doing everything alone. It isn't. In terms of total assistance relative to the size of the economy, European countries contribute far more than the United States. Countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Norway contribute the highest percentage of their GDP to Ukraine. Poland alone has donated billions in humanitarian and military aid, also bearing the enormous cost of hosting refugees, which Polish households, not international institutions, have largely absorbed. Then there's the cost of US military aid. Many Americans are surprised to learn that a significant portion of US aid to Ukraine is not money handed over as cash, but rather weapons drawn from existing Pentagon stockpiles. This is followed by new contracts awarded to American defense companies to replenish those stockpiles. In other words, the money doesn't go to Ukraine. It goes to American manufacturers. The funding stimulates domestic jobs and strengthens America's own military readiness. It's not a loss, it's an investment. Even former US generals have openly stated that supporting Ukraine is one of the cheapest ways in history to degrade a major adversary without deploying American soldiers. Russia is losing equipment at such a scale that it would take decades to rebuild, even with sanctions lifted. For the US, the Ukrainian crisis is geopolitically priceless. Meanwhile, some Americans treat Ukraine as if it's a financial desert. It isn't. The US spent trillions in Afghanistan and Iraq. In comparison, the support provided to Ukraine is only a small fraction of the amount spent on Afghanistan and Iraq. And unlike those conflicts, Ukraine's war is directly tied to the stability of Europe. America's Ukraine is the largest economic partner and plays a crucial role in the preservation of the global democratic order. But the situation brings us to something deeper: the growing influence of isolationism and misinformation within the American political sphere. Individuals, especially those aligned with MAGA-style populism, often frame Ukraine as a distant, irrelevant country unworthy of American support. They repeat talking points that trace back to Russian propaganda outlets like RT and Sputnik. These narratives include: Ukraine is corrupt. Why help them? America should address its problems first. Europe should pay for its defense. NATO provoked Russia. Every one of these statements has been debunked repeatedly, but repetition provides them emotional power. And this is exactly where my personal frustration kicks in. In Poland and Central Europe, these talking points are more than just abstract political opinions. They're dangerous. They weaken Western unity. They embolden Russia. They delay support at critical moments. And worst of all, they reveal how shockingly little some Western commentators understand about the stakes. For Poland, Ukraine's survival is not a charity project. It is the defense of our region. The notion that America should retreat creates an opening for Russia, which could potentially lead to the destabilization of NATO's eastern flank. Poland knows this. The Baltic states know this. Finland knows this. But somehow, the loudest voices shaping the American narrative often seem to be the ones who know the least about the region they're talking about. At this point, I want to zoom out and talk about something more philosophical: the idea of responsibility. This concept encompasses not only national responsibility, but also personal responsibility. Presidents, ministers, and military leaders are not the only ones shaping politics in today's world. Ordinary people shape politics by sharing opinions online, repeating information, voting, staying silent, or speaking up. And in that sense, every one of us, including you listening right now, plays a part in shaping the future. One of the greatest problems in Western political culture today is the illusion that staying neutral is harmless. Shrugging your shoulders and saying, "I don't care about politics," is somehow virtuous. But neutrality in the face of injustice is never impartial. Silence is a stance, and usually it's the stance that benefits the aggressor. The 20th century taught Poland a painful lesson. The world saw Hitler and Stalin carving up Central Europe in 1939. The world saw Hungary crushed in 1956, and Czechoslovakia invaded in 1968. The world saw Poland's solidarity movement struggle in the 1980s. Occasionally the world helped. At times, the world simply observes. But the pattern is clear. Every time authoritarian power meets little resistance, it grows bolder. That is why indifference is dangerous. When Westerners say, "Why should we care about Ukraine?" they reveal a privilege that comes from living in places shielded by oceans or the large buffers of stable democratic countries. But in Central Europe, the question is reversed. How can we not care? Because the consequences of not caring fall on us immediately. We don't have 1,000 kilometers of safety. We don't have a buffer zone. We are the buffer zone. And this is where misunderstandings between Western and Eastern audiences often start. Many people in the US and Western Europe genuinely believe that global conflicts will not touch them. They see Ukraine as something far away, a tragedy on another continent. However, the interconnectedness of Europe's stability, an entire network of democracies, is a fact. If Russia were to expand its aggression beyond Ukraine, the security architecture of Europe would collapse. And when that happens, the economic, political, and military consequences will echo across the Atlantic. But let me speak more personally for a moment. Part of why I decided to start this podcast, and why I'm speaking directly to a Western audience, is because I'm tired of seeing my region misunderstood, underestimated, or reduced to stereotypes. I'm tired of hearing people who have never set foot in Central Europe explain our fears to us. I'm tired of watching foreign commentators describe Russian aggression as if it were some complex psychological drama instead of what it actually is: imperialism. And I'm tired of the condescension that often comes from those who believe that wealth or geographic distance provides them superior insight. Occasionally, the people with the clearest perspectives are the ones closest to the danger. Those with a deep-rooted historical memory often provide the most accurate warnings. Often, it's the uncomfortable truths that demand the loudest voice. And yes, part of this feeling is frustration. But part of this emotion is also hope. I firmly believe that if Westerners truly listened to Eastern Europeans, the world would become much more comprehensible. The patterns would become clearer. The stakes would be easier to understand. And the unity within the democratic world would be much stronger. This podcast is my small contribution toward that understanding. So, as we come to the end of this first episode, I want to leave you with a few key thoughts. Not as some grand conclusion, but as an invitation. Because everything I've shared today is my perspective, my interpretation, my analysis. I don't claim to have a monopoly on truth, nor do I expect anyone to accept my views uncritically. In fact, I encourage you to challenge them, but challenge them with arguments, not slogans, with facts, not memes. The first takeaway is simple. Poland is not the caricature many Westerners still carry in their heads. We are not a frozen relic of the past, nor are we an unstable frontier. We are a modern European nation, shaped by hard-earned experience, vigilant because history taught us vigilance, and committed to democracy because we know the cost of losing it. The old stereotypes of Eastern Europe simply do not reflect reality in 2025. The second takeaway is even more crucial. Our concerns about Russia are not rooted in emotion, but in historical memory and observable behavior. Living in a region that the same imperial power repeatedly targets, caution is not paranoia, it's survival. When Russia invades a neighboring democracy during daylight hours, that caution transforms into responsibility. The third takeaway is that the war in Ukraine is not just Ukraine's war. It is the front line of a larger struggle between authoritarian expansion and democratic resilience. Whether individuals acknowledge it or not, the world remains interconnected. What happens in Kiev doesn't stay there. It affects Warsaw, Vilnius, Helsinki, Berlin, London, Ottawa, and yes, Washington. The idea that this conflict is far away is an illusion, and a dangerous one. The fourth takeaway is personal. You don't need to be a general, a diplomat, or a political scientist to have a voice. Ordinary people shape public opinion. Ordinary people amplify truth or lies. Ordinary people decide whether disinformation thrives or dies. And ordinary people vote. Silence is a choice, but it's rarely a neutral one. Every time someone chooses apathy, they create space for those who thrive in chaos. And finally, the last takeaway is a request. Engage with me. Comment. Disagree. Expand. Offer your own experiences. Tell me where you think I'm right and where you think I'm wrong. I'm not here to preach from a pedestal. I'm here to have a conversation that crosses borders, perspectives, and experiences. My door, or in this case, my comment section, is open to everyone willing to discuss matters with civility and intellectual honesty. If what I said today resonated with you, or if it challenged you, or if it simply made you think, consider subscribing. Like the video if you feel it added value. Share it with someone who might benefit from a different perspective. And hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next episode. Speaking of which, the next episode will tackle a topic that's both sensitive and necessary. Donald Trump. Not as a messiah of American renewal, but as a destabilizing force whose populism threatens not only the US, but global democratic stability. I'm going to dissect why the cult of personality surrounding him is dangerous, why authoritarian tendencies should never be ignored, and why his worldview aligns far more with illiberal regimes than with the democratic values America claims to defend. Whether you agree with me or not, I hope you'll tune in. For now, thank you for listening. Thank you for giving me your time, your attention, and your willingness to hear a Central European voice that often becomes drowned in the noise. This is just the beginning, and I'm genuinely grateful that you're here for it. See you in the next episode.